Sometimes it's the little things that cause the biggest issues. And with OpenXR Toolkit, small tweaks can mean big gains in both performance and visual clarity. This is part 3 of our series where we explore the most overlooked settings for VR in Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what this toolkit can do and how to use it effectively. And we're starting right now. So first off, I've dropped the download link for the toolkit in the description. Just install it, launch your sim in VR, and then press Ctrl plus F2 to bring it up. You can change the navigation buttons on the app itself when you're first setting it up. Now, when you go to the website, there'll be this long write-up from the developer. I'll be real with you, I really didn't read all of that stuff on the site. I just downloaded it, tried it, and it worked. No issues so far in Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024. Just know that it's not actively supported anymore according to what they wrote on the website. So if it breaks in the future, I mean, that's it. But for now, still one of the best tools out there. Okay, so once you've downloaded the software and you pull it up in VR, we're going to go to the menu tab first, and menu timeout, you definitely want to change that to none. That way you can close the menu when you're ready. Now the other options on the menu tab are really a personal choice, how big you want the font, how much opacity you want, and those sorts of stuff. So get that tucked away to what's comfortable for you, and then we're going to move on. So first up on the performance tab, let's look at the overlay and target frame rate. Now, if you want to actively view the performance info on screen to see what's happening, you can turn on one of the overlay options, then turn it off whenever you want. But here's a catch. The target frame rate option only shows up when the overlay is on. So what you do is you set the overlay to FPS, adjust the target frame rate to 45 frames per second, and then you can turn the overlay back off. Even with the overlay off, that 45 frames per second target stays active in the background, so everything keeps working as expected. Next, we've got the upscaling / sharpening, and we have selected CAS. That is just sharpening, no upscaling. Since we are already using DLSS from inside the sim, we don't want to add any resolution scale in here. So CAS just helps clean up that image a little bit. Now here's the thing, sharpening stacks. So you want to get the most out of your sharpness from inside the sim. That's your clean base. Anything you add after that, like from OpenXR Toolkit or Virtual Desktop, should just be like minor touch-ups. If you're sharpening too much in multiple places, you're not really layering quality, you're actually layering artifacts. Now, I usually play with the CAS value. Right now, I have it set at 65 and it's looking good for me. But sharpening is one of those things that I always find myself testing and adjusting. So you can, maybe start at 65 and tweak it up and down and see what works best for you. Then we have fixed foveated rendering. I set it to preset. Now what this does is it reduces the resolution in the outer edges of your view to help save on performance. But it keeps the focal point in the center sharp. That's where your eyes are like actually looking. And we're also using the cull outer mask, which skips drawing pixels that you never actually see. And this obviously is going to give us some free performance with no visual downside at all. Under that, we have set the mode to quality and the pattern to wide. That means the resolution drops off gently across a wider area, which gives a good balance between clarity and GPU savings. Now, Microsoft does have its own built-in fixed foveated rendering option that is new to the sim. I think it was officially released in Sim Update 2. But so far in my testing, I've been actually getting better results with the OpenXR Toolkit fixed foveated rendering. But who knows, that might change with Sim Update 3, so I'll keep testing both, and you should probably do the same. Then moving right along, we have turbo mode, and this might just be the most powerful setting in this entire toolkit. How it works with our setup is that it kind of acts like a middleman, helping to clean up the frame timing between the Sim and OpenXR runtime. Now, if you've watched part 1 and 2 of this series, you already know that we've configured our base so that the Sim gives us 45 frames per second, and space warp in the virtual desktop, that fills the gap. So we end up seeing 90 frames per second in the headset. At least that's our target. But the problem with this is that sometimes the Sim will render at 22.2 milliseconds per frame, then 24 milliseconds, then 27 milliseconds, then 20 milliseconds. You get the idea. That uneven frame timing makes the frame generation process less accurate. So what Turbo actually does is it forces the Sim to deliver those 45 frames per second at a more steady rhythm, trying to keep it at 22.2 milliseconds per frame thereabouts. That is going to be the most even timing. That way, Space Warp can count on those frames arriving evenly, and it will then interpolate the generated frames more accurately. The result is going to be smoother motion and fewer micro judders. Now, just to point out, at the bottom you'll see a warning sign saying that Turbo blocks reprojection, but that doesn't apply to Space Warp on virtual desktop with the Quest 3. That warning is for other runtime setups like WMR and those types of stuff. So now let's move over to frame rate throttling. So this puts a hard cap on how fast frames are submitted to the headset, but we have already locked to 45 frames per second and enabled turbo, so there's no need to throttle things further in the setup. We just leave it off. Then we have record statistics and high rate statistics. So these two options are for logging performance data. The record statistics saves your log sessions, and the high rate statistics increase how often it samples the data. We're not doing any benchmarking right now, and actually I'll use something different in any case, so I leave them both off. But I mean, if you're chasing stutters or testing settings, these can help track what's actually happening behind the scene, but I use cap frame X to do that. Alright, so let's move over to the appearance tab, where we've got post-processing turned off. This is for things like color grading, exposure, saturation filters. We're keeping it off since we're not doing any visual tweaks through the toolkit. Now, that being said, I have played with this in the past, and it definitely can help. But the problem is that there's no one size fits all, and what looks great at 2 p.m. in New York might look awful at 5 p.m. in China. You know, lighting conditions, weather, time of day, all of those things change how these filters will affect the image. And you know, further to that, Microsoft has recently added some exposure controls in the in-game settings as well, which helps, but even then you find yourself needing to adjust often. You know, honestly, I wish the Sim would just auto-tune this based on like time of day or scene brightness and whatnot, but we can hope. Okay, next up we have world scale. I set that at 100%. That's 1:1 with real world proportions. You could tweak this if the cockpit ever feels too big or too small, but in most cases 100% is where you want to leave it. Then we have over prediction reduction. And most people don't need to touch it. VR headsets predict where your head is going to be to keep the motion smooth. But if that prediction overshoots, you can get slight wobble or ghosting. This setting lets you reduce how far ahead it predicts. But unless you're noticing motion artifacts when you're turning your head, really, you could just leave this at 0 and don't mess with it. Alright, moving over to the System tab. First one up is Override Resolution. Now I've turned it on here just to show it, and when I do use it, this is the setting I use, which is about 114% of the Quest 3's native resolution, but usually I have it off. And what it does is it lets you manually set the render resolution, which affects how sharp the image is, but it also hits the GPU a little bit harder. At around 114%, you'll get a noticeably sharper cockpit, but depending on your rig, it could also cause stutters or performance drops, especially in heavy scenery. The bigger issue though is upscaling conflict. If you're already using DLSS inside the sim and you try to override the resolution here on top of that, you're basically stacking upscalers, and that can blur things or mess with sharpness unpredictability. So unless you're running TAA or have DLSS turned off, probably best to leave this one off and let your in-game settings control that scaling. Then we move down to color gains. So this lets you individually boost or cut your red, blue, or green in the image. It's kind of like adjusting the color balance on a monitor. I left all of these on 50, which is neutral. I have experimented with pushing these values in the past, especially alongside post-processing settings, and yes, you can get a nice look out of it. But the problem is what looks good in one environment, let's say sunrise in Miami, can look completely off somewhere else, like late afternoon in Tokyo. So you end up constantly chasing these values every time the scene changes, and honestly, it's just not worth the time. So unless you're trying to correct something specific, probably best to leave these alone. Okay, then we go on to field of view. So I have it set to simple, and right now I have it set at 100, which works out to 180 degrees. That's the full image with no cropping. I've tested 90% and 95% in the past, and it's actually a really easy way to save performance, especially if you're running on a more mid-range rig and you don't mind giving up a bit of peripheral vision. But with the 1590, I really don't need to reduce it, so I leave it at 100. But this is one of those settings that you can and should adjust depending on your rig and what you're willing to trade for a few extra frames. Then we have zoom. I have it at 100%. It controls how far in or out the image appears. Leaving this at 100%, anything else can distort, scale, or cause motion weirdness. So that should just be left at 100%. Then we move on to blind eye. Obviously leave that at none unless you have some impairment in one of your eyes. It's pretty self-explanatory. So unless you have eyesight in one eye alone, leave that off. Then we have disable mask. So disable mask is off. So the headset's built-in lens mask is still active. That's what we want, because the mask hides any visual artifacts in the far edges of your view. Disabling that usually doesn't improve clarity, so I leave it as is. Then at the end, you'll see the menu tab again, and I have already discussed that, so it's mostly personal choices. And that's it for part 3 of our series. Hopefully this gave you a better understanding of what the OpenXR Toolkit actually does and how to make it work for your VR setup. Anyway, thanks for watching, and be sure to check out part 4, where we dive into the DLSS swapper, including how to upgrade to DLSS 4 and why it matters in VR. I'm going to leave a link to that video right about here. Thanks a lot. See you in the next one.